I'm going to take you through a brutal Grand Prix Attack, an old favourite of mine. It's the top board clash between a wonder Liang and Anton Korobov. Going into this game, Korobov led the tournament by half a point. There are a few players just behind him, including a wonder Liang who'd just beaten Vasily Ivanchuk. Perhaps you saw my previous video on that game. So wonder Liang had the white pieces. He went knight c3, already a clue that he's going to play something different. d6, Korobov wants to go back into his favourite Najdorf variation if white plays knight f3 and d4, for example. But now bishop b5 check. Now this is an interesting way to get into a Grand Prix. It's quite flexible, gives you options to play in a different way as well. So if knight c6 here, this is an old trap. Knight c6 is a mistake. Then we take, and that pawn structure makes it very difficult for black to find counterplay. That's another story on another DVD. Actually, that's on one of my PowerPlay DVDs, but we won't go there at the moment. Probably the most solid move is to play bishop d7 here, and now white can play more positionally with a4, or you can take and go into a Grand Prix. But Korobov, well, he wanted a fight. He's looking to grab the two bishops and has played knight d7. Problem with knight d7 is that means a knight can no longer take control over d4, and that gives white more options here. a4 is a very interesting move. Let's see what Liang has in mind. So f4. This is the start of the Grand Prix attack. White launches forward on the king side, and it's extremely dangerous. Now, a6 by Korobov. He would like white to give up the two bishops. Even this isn't so clear if white plays pawn to a5, crippling black's queenside pawns. Now that bishop does turn into a bit of a monster piece, but it's possible to play like this for white. But instead, Liang plays a really interesting move. He just nudges back to c4. So you could say, well, white has wasted time going to b5 and then coming back again. In fact, he's induced black's knight to come to this poor square on d7 so that it can't get into d4 in this way. And a4 was simply a way of covering the bishop so that it doesn't have to worry about b5. Really interesting stuff. e6, very prudent move, very sensible. Important in this position to lock that bishop out. So both sides decide to castle. And b6. Very tricky position already. If white pushes on, watch what happens. We take and take on e5. This diagonal is open. Let me just show that. Knight takes knight. Queen check. Double attack. You pick up the knight, so black wins a pawn. Back we go. So white can't go forward straight away. Instead, queen e1. Okay, the normal move in these kind of Grand Prix positions. The queen might find its way out here at some point. Also looks in this direction and sometimes supports this pawn. Bishop b7. It's interesting that Korobov is setting up a bit like a Najdorf actually. But of course the structure is very different when this pawn supports the pawn on e4, so e4 simply isn't vulnerable. But black has to be wary of d5, and that's why Liang played the bishop back to b3, anticipating d5. So if d5 comes, then we close with e5, and we get this kind of actually quite a favourable French position. Maybe, I don't know about d4 straight away, but maybe swing the knight round to the king side and potentially c3 and bishop c2, and that could be quite a nice French position where white attacks on the king side. But instead we had rook c8 from Korobov, And now it's possible just to hang around for a little bit, play bishop d2, maybe king h1, some preparatory moves. But Liang was in no mood to hang around. He pressed on straight away. Very interesting move. So pushing the knight away from its post on f6. Now bishop d2. And once again, if black tries d5, well, it's not clear that closing the position is particularly good once this knight swings round. g6 is a very interesting move, looking to redeploy the knight to g7 and then looking to take control over f5 at some moment. But of course, it does weaken these dark squares around the king. And Liang exploits this straight away with f5, the classic Grand Prix attack pawn sacrifice. More on that in a second. It is possible to play knight here, which would provoke this move, and the knight comes back to f2. I mean, that's still a really tense position. But no, after just 1.5 minutes, f5. I really like the ambition that Liang shows in this game. So this pawn could be taken. It should be taken, of course. If the e-pawn takes, then we push on. And for the pawn, white certainly has pretty decent compensation, considering that, well, this bishop will have to move. But white controls the d5 square, and it's difficult to expel the queen for the moment. I think all we can say is decent compensation. And actually, I was expecting that. But incredibly, after really not very much time at all, Korobov courageously took that pawn with the knight's pawn, opening up his king. So it's possible to play bishop h6 to win an exchange. Because if knight g7, then queen g3, and that is game over. But actually, black gets incredible compensation. Let's just see this. And now bishop d6, those bishops strike across the board. And white is left with this rotten bishop on b3, really not doing very much at all, whereas black's bishops, in combination with the queen and potentially the knight and potentially the rook on the g-file, well, that is from nowhere a murderous attack, very well judged by Korobov. Instead, Liang took on d6. Now once again, bishop h6 is possible, and black will simply give up the exchange. This is a beautiful clump of pawns. Take away so many squares from white's pieces, and that gives black the cover to set up an attack on the g-file, and in combination with that bishop, this is, well, all we can say is fantastic compensation. So Liang played, again, in a very enterprising way. Didn't bother to take any material. He swung the knight round, so he's looking to get that knight over in this direction, maybe on h5 via one of these squares. So Korobov exchanged this off, takes one of the attackers away, and that allows this knight to come in and potentially block out the kingside from here. Downside is it allows white's rook to this very dangerous square on h3. c4 first, that opens up some nice lines and isolates pawn. And bishop f6. So he's just packing out the kingside. He's a pawn up. He's making sure that this knight can come over to defend, and this bishop defends on this diagonal as well. So for the moment it seems as though black is okay. Bishop c3. I was a little bit surprised that Korobov didn't go for knight g4 in this position, because that knight, seems to be on a very dangerous square. Instead he went for knight g6. Maybe he just felt this is just more secure. This knight certainly is not going to be budged from g6. And also starts the process, well, it might be good at some moment to exchange off these bishops and then bring the queen in its place. Queen d2 looks in this direction, but no, he's having none of that. Let's push the queen away again. But that's clever, because now the bishop comes off this diagonal, meaning that this bishop is still pretty good. And also he's nudged the queen to d1, so he might be angling for queen h5. Just when I thought Liang had no compensation for this pawn, just that little shuffle, and suddenly, there are ideas here. So black needs to be very careful. I think this next maneuver from Korobov is excellent. He played knight to e8. This piece gets in the way. It's funny. You can see these squares are taken, gets in the way of the queen, but knight e8 is a beautiful move, looking to either come to f6 or g7. So this knight now isn't doing too much. Knight d4. Knight came to g7. And now the bishop comes back to this very important square. Queen d2. White is still looking to get the queen in here. Looks dangerous, but h5 shuts out that rook. And, well, I mean, this is an extraordinary concentration of forces on the king side. Look, it's unbelievable how black is kind of packing out the position. But white still has chances. Here I was very surprised that Liang didn't play d4. It means that black is not exchanging these bishops. There is later on potential to push with d5 to try and break up those pawns. And you never know when this bishop might be able to cut back here. It seemed to me that that kept the most tension in the position. Also means that this queen, of course, is blocked from coming to f6 to defend on the king side. So I thought the game was still very much in the balance. Rook f1, also dangerous. Just switching a rook over in the general direction of black's king. Rook e8. Now that's sort of preempting a possible queen h6 and making sure that the king will always be able to escape. And here, well, it's possible to exchange and play bishop c4. Maybe that's the most solid way of playing, even though black is a pawn up, but that would kind of hold things on the queen side. Instead, bishop c4 straight away, and I think Liang had simply overlooked b5, pushing away the bishop, because of course, if that is taken, then queen b6, check, and wins the bishop. So that bishop has to come back, and that was really a waste of time, and has given black the chance to counter-attack. Looking at these two pieces, and things have definitely turned in black's favour. And just to add to the fun, Korobov was ahead on the clock. Liang was running short of time. So that is pawn number 2. But Liang didn't give up. The queen swooped in. Got to be very careful. Now, I thought the simplest way was to just push this pawn here, but instead rook c7. Careful move. Perhaps guarding on the second rank. Rook g3, queen f6. I couldn't quite see how white was going to break through. d4 finally gives maybe some options to push here, opens this up. Rook c3. So that means if this knight moves, then at least some rooks, pair of rooks can be exchanged. Remember, if the knight comes into g5 and there's a check here, the king actually very happily runs out here, and it's very safe behind all those pawns. Rook g5, he's not giving up. Now the pawn is pushed. Still looks a bit scary, but Korobov has actually calculated extremely well. If knight takes knight, then the pawn drops on d4, and then b2, and this is hopeless. With a rook should be arriving at on c1 before very long, and white just doesn't have an attack at the other end of the board. So it went rook d1, so that means that this knight can now move and the pawn on d4 is protected. But b2, this looks dire now. Liang broke through on g6, but it was too late. There was a convincing way to victory, and that's rook c1. And the tactics work in black's favour. Of course, if this is taken here, then we take check, and that is an extra rook. And otherwise, rook takes f6. This was the game continuation, so he gave up his queen temporarily. So it's a rook and knight against a queen, but basically there's not a lot that can be done about this pawn. It's funny how white's pieces end up on the other side of the board and simply can't return. And how well does a knight defend the king? Very well here. King g3 and rook c1, that was the final move of the game, because there's no good defense to the pawn promoting to a new queen, and that really is game over. I thought Korobov defended with great confidence, actually. He took this decision to sacrifice an exchange very quickly, and that shows, as I said, enormous confidence in his own judgment, and proved to be correct. It would have been really dangerous for a Wonder Liang to take that exchange. Instead, well, I was impressed by his bravery, the bravery of both players. Wonder Liang was going for it at the very least, and managed to put a lot of pressure on his opponent. However, this victory means that Korobov goes into the final round a half a point clear, the player in second place, Durabayli, but Korobov looking good for first place at the moment. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and if you'd like to support us, we'd be very grateful. Do check out the links to PayPal and patreon.com. Thanks very much for watching.